Well, we weren't happy about Seton Hall being in the NIT because of the fact that everyone knew that they deserved to be in the NCAA tournament. However, they have been making the most of their NIT appearance. Although it's come with some difficulty, they needed overtime to beat St. Joe's, but against the reigning NIT champions from North Texas, they looked the part of the number one overall seed in the NIT and a team that should have been in the NCAA tournament, which we all know by now. So I'm Tim Best. He's Pat Madden, and joining us this week as our guest to talk about these two wins, look ahead to the NIT quarterfinal matchup at Walsh Wednesday night with UNLV with a spot to the NIT Final Four at Hinkle Fieldhouse on the line. He is the creator of Daly Dose of Hoops, a tremendous blog covering college hoops in the tri-state area, and he's one of the best, if not the best, in terms of covering the Metro Atlantic Athletic Conference. It's none other than Jaden Daly. Jaden, Pat and I, we're obviously big fans of your work, and we really appreciate you being our guest for this week.
I'm just as big a fan of you and Pat, Tim. Thank you very much for having me on. It's my honor, and hopefully I can do you guys proud here.
We trust that you will. So now, let's talk about the fact that first round against St. Joe's, we've saw a lot in the past. Rutgers got beat in the first round of the NITs. Same with Clemson and Michigan as well. But Seton Hall, they had the attitude and the personnel, considering, they didn't have any opt-outs, that they wanted to take this tournament in full stride, and they did, although St. Joe's played really well out of the gates, but Seton Hall, in typical Seton Hall fashion, they just found a way to win. So what were your takeaways from that St. Joe's game on Wednesday, or was it Tuesday last week?
Yeah, it was last Tuesday, and you know what, Tim? I was there covering that. It looked like St. Joe's was going to drive away with it midway through the second half before Seton Hall went on that run. And the run that took the lead, and then ultimately again in overtime when Alamir Dawes stepped up and Dylan Adewusu was excellent all night. Dre Davis was Dre Davis. They all picked up for Kadari Richmond, who had a rougher night than usual. And he atoned for that in the North Texas game, and we'll get into that later, I'm sure. But what I saw from Seton Hall in that St. Joe's game was a team that knew what it was out to accomplish, a team that reached a consensus that they wanted to keep playing, that they felt as though they had nothing to lose, the five seniors and the five starters. And Shaheen Holloway mentioned that in his post-game press conference. I saw a team that just didn't want to be denied. And then I saw that again Saturday. We'll get into that too. But the grit that we've seen from the Seton Hall team all season, Tim, was on full display in that St. Joe's game, overcoming Eric Reynolds, overcoming the big man of Sandico. And St. Joe's didn't have Lynn Greer. That was a big shot in the arm for the Pirates as well. But when I looked at Seton Hall, I just saw a team that didn't want to be denied, a team that refused to lose. And at this time of year, that's what you need. It doesn't matter who you are, and it doesn't matter what level you are. When you have guys that just put the team on their collective backs, that adds up to more than anything.
Pat,
I think. Go ahead. Oh no, go ahead. I think something, and a lot of this came out in the notes that Jason Gruett wrote. We'll get to that in a second. But what do you think playing in Walsh does? I know Kevin Willard hated playing in Walsh, probably because it's a smaller building, probably for a number of reasons. But this was, I think, Shaheen Holloway's maybe second or third game ever in Walsh as the Seton Hall head coach. So what do you think the mentality of getting to play in Walsh might do to these players that's different than if they're playing this game in Newark?
It's a tremendous home court advantage, Pat. You have the fans right on top of you. You have a more invested community. And I love how you mentioned the dichotomy between Kevin Willard hating playing there so adamantly and so vehemently, whereas with Shah, an alumnus, leading his alma mater, he gets it. He recognizes the value that the on-campus gym provides. Yeah, it only seats, 1,500, but when that 1,500 rises as one and that gym gets packed and that gym gets rocking, it's as loud as anybody in the country. And that's something that visiting teams will have a hard time dealing with, just the unique nature of the gym and how it's set up, the atmosphere when everything's clicking on on all cylinders and at full octane. That's something that St. Joe's had a hard time with, and something that North Texas couldn't handle on Saturday as Seton Hall jumped on them from the beginning. Walsh is a tremendous home court advantage. And I say this to St. John's people all the time when they like to knock Carnesecca. Carnesecca is the same way for St. John's as Walsh is for Seton Hall. The small on-campus venues are still unrivaled in that aspect.
Now, with the fact that you mentioned Seton Hall wasn't gonna allow themselves to lose this game, refuse to lose. I mean, for Alamir Dawes he struggled for a good amount of the game, but for this grad student from Newark, how special was it to see him tie the game with a three to send it overtime, and then continuing to make big shot after big shot, stepping up when Kadari just didn't have his best stuff in that game against St. Joe's.
That's Al, and I think Al being a playmaker is probably the best Alamir Dawes that Seton Hall can have. He's a great knockdown shooter, and we've seen that too. But when he can create for himself as well as take the big shot, it just adds another dimension that you don't see from some other backcourts at some of the other high major programs where you have a guy who can do both. And Al has no problem strapping a rocket to his back or putting the team on his back. He's a winner. He's a gamer. You saw that against St. Joe's when he and Dylan Adewusu picked up for Kadari. And he's just found ways to go above and beyond and even stretch his own limits this season. He's created such a lasting impression this year that it's going to be very hard to replace him next year or whenever his eligibility runs out. I'm actually not sure right now if he still has one more. I don't believe he does.
I don't think so either. Now, the North Texas game, I mean, you had some difficulties in the first half. Bediako got in foul trouble. North Texas was hitting their shots early. Once they got ice cold, that opened the door for Seton Hall to go on a big first half surge. But it was great to see a guy that kind of didn't make an impact, or if he did make any impact, it was very minimal. But what was it like watching Isaiah Coleman, the freshman, making such a big impact in that first half, punctuated with that three at the horn to go up 9?
Yeah, I was going to mention Isaiah Coleman, so thank you for leading me into that. I watched that one from the home office, and when Isaiah Coleman gets the call and he comes out and has something to prove, and you saw that on Saturday, he gives this team an X factor that maybe gets overlooked because of how vital and how valuable the starting five is to this team. And Seton Hall's bench has been a lightning rod for criticism all year, but Coleman had a big game in the non-conference. I think it was the third game of the year against Albany, where he went off early on and you saw glimpses of what he could be. And as a freshman, for a player's coach like Shaw, who's not going to throw you into the fire, but still going to demand just enough out of you, he's in such a great situation. I can't wait to see what he does as a sophomore. And days like what he had Saturday are going to be commonplace moving forward. I was very, very satisfied and very impressed with what he did in the first half and how he upheld that momentum in the second half of that game Saturday. Seton Hall's got a future star if he doesn't go into the portal.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the $64,000 question, but that's a question for a different day, probably. I mean, that day could have been Thursday if they had lost the St. Joseph's game earlier last week, and it will probably be at least until next Thursday or even beyond that if they get to the NIT Final Four next week. Coleman, The other guy I'd like, and this is a guy you've been following for years, and that is Dylan Adewusu. Not necessarily the most popular player with the Seton Hall fan base. I think that there was a little. I think the expectations were a little high for him, in part because the numbers that he had when he got opportunities at St. John's looked pretty good, as well as the fact that there was always this notion of, well, don't you really want to play better because you're trying to stick at the St. John's? Because, for all intents and purposes, he didn't want to play for Rick Pitino, and Rick Pitino didn't necessarily want him to play for them. So what's your? I think Lucy's played a lot better in the month of March. So what's your sense about the mindset of Dylan Adewusu as we've seen him go through the NIT?
He has picked it up as the season's gone on. He may be inconsistent and maddeningly frustrating to watch, especially if you're a Seton Hall fan, and as if you were a St. John's fan the last couple of years, I'm sure you felt the same way. But what he provides is a grittiness, a toughness to him on both ends. He's more of a defensive player. That's obvious and that's plain to see. But when he has it going offensively, and we've seen him hit a couple of threes in several games the last couple of weeks, he could be that fourth scorer that Seton Hall desperately needs behind Kadari, Allen, Dre. And with one more year left, he's probably going to be counted on a lot more next year, regardless of what everybody else does. He's going to be more of a spark plug, going to need to be more of a spark plug to keep this team on the right track that it's on right now.
Do you think he's going to if you had to make a guess, and everything with the portal is just a total, crapshoot, but if you had to have a guess, do you think he hangs around next year if the circumstances are the same in terms of, everything else, all things being equal?
I would say he comes back. Right now, looking at everything in front of me right now as I see it, I would say he comes back.
Yeah, I could see that happening, especially because, with Al going, if you can retain Isaiah Coleman, I mean, that you still have a good backcourt, and all you got to do is maybe fill in the gap if Kadari does leave. But I feel like, there's still a lot of basketball to be played, and, speculation, we'll leave it as just that. But honestly, just watching on TV, and Jaden, I know you'll agree with this, for watching from your home office, that crowd against North Texas specifically, even against St. Joe's, it was amazing to hear and see the fans be so invested in this team, even though they all wish they were competing in the NCAA tournament. It was just so great seeing them so invested and hearing them be so invested, and make enough of a difference to will this team on and get them now to the NIT quarterfinals to the point, where they want to, and the team wants to stick it to the committee and win the whole thing, kind of like how the Cleveland Indians in Major League wanted to stick it to Rachel Phelps by winning the division and beating the Yankees.
Oh, I love that. And yeah, absolutely. To see the way that the fan base has rallied around this team, and covering the Big East as I do, I get shots from all different walks of life about how Seton Hall has no fan base. Seton Hall's atmosphere sucks, whatever. It didn't suck on Saturday, and it hasn't sucked most of the year. I can tell you that much. This group has embraced what Shah has turned this team into. It's a team made in his own image, a blue-collar, no-nonsense group that is going to fight to the end, fight to the death, and will not rest until they've done what they've set out to do, no matter the result. So when you have a fan base that has rallied behind this group and has embraced them, that's half the battle right there. And Sean noted it in his press conference on Saturday. I got the audio from it, and that was a great question that Jerry Carino asked at the end of it. And to hear the heartfelt response of how much this fan base means to the coach and to the players is more of an indictment on how Seton Hall has retooled and restructured itself post Willard than anything else.
What do you think turned the switch this season as opposed to at times last season? Because obviously there were a lot of press conferences you did with Holloway where he seemed very frustrated with things. He gave a lot of cryptic answers about how Kadari Richmond practiced or played in games. But now, if you flip the script over to this season, Holloway's been a lot more complimentary of his players. Holloway seems to, give out a lot more praise. What do you think changed in the dynamic? Because, obviously the key players, Holloway, Dre Davis, Alamir Dawes, are basically all the same. But what do you think changed with Holloway's attitude towards this year's team as opposed to last year's team?
I don't really think anything changed, Pat. I think having the core of last year's team back for another season and knowing what to expect has probably ignited this group further. The continuity is invaluable in college basketball, no matter who you are. And to see that with the big three of Kadari, Allen, Dre, and then you add in veterans like Bediako, veterans like Elijah Hutchins Everett off the bench, even though he didn't do as much. And then you add in a guy like Dylan Adewusu, who's been through the conference for 3 years. It only has a positive effect, and that makes the continuity better. It makes the experience better. There's not much of an adjustment period because guys know what they're dealing with. They know what they're signing up for and getting themselves into. And I think the fact that Seton Hall is an older team has probably aided the transition and helped guys mesh better with each other.
So something I didn't want to forget this. I wanted to bring it up from the first half of that North Texas game. I felt the vibes change internally. I'm trying to find at what point this happened, but when Jaquan Sanders, I don't even think he played against St. Joe's, but coming in the first half and Sanders making that three just under 6 minutes left in the first half, it was 18-17, and it was 15-7 the rest of the half. But that Quan hitting that three, I felt just from watching at home, I felt the vibe really changed because we haven't really seen a lot of Sanders on the court in general, but for him to hit a three like that, I mean, how important was that to get that kind of shot from a guy who, was going to go to St. John's, ended up at Seton Hall, and you have faith that I had faith he was going to be the breakout guy on this team. Didn't pan out to it, but that three just made such a big impact.
Absolutely. It was the spark that they needed, and he didn't play at all in the St. Joe's game. Barely practiced a couple days after that. He was dealing with the flu, so to have him still not at full strength and provide such a lift and such a role in that first half against North Texas, it just speaks to maybe not the depth that Seton Hall has, but the confidence that each member of the team, coach, assistant coach, player, what have you, has in one another. And I think that's helped Sanders whenever he's gone out there. He's had a couple of double-figure games. I think he had one against St. John's earlier in the year. So to have him step up and be the guy that kick-started the run, I think that bodes well for this group moving forward, no matter when the next game is. Obviously, it'll be Wednesday against UNLV, but they can carry that in the offseason too.
Right, and Sanders obviously is a guy who, in part, he's got a. I don't know what happened this season between, was he that we'll have to find out a lot more in the offseason. I think part of it also goes to, Holloway's going to play the players who are playing the best, whether they're players who are playing well in practice or playing better in games. You don't want to break up that lineup if that lineup is performing well on the court. You don't want to just put a bench in for the sake of playing a bench in. You have to play a rotation that's going to continue what you're doing and doing well. Maybe if we look at UNLV just quickly, I know we haven't had a lot of time to look at UNLV because the game ended very late last night. They have a couple of interesting forwards. I think they're the Booth brothers, both guys who came from Oklahoma State. I think one of them took a detour to Pacific along the way. But they're both 6'7", 6'8" guys. Both guys are very good rebounders. So what's going to be a few of the keys for Seton Hall to get past a tougher UNLV team that a lot of people are going to give them credit for?
Yeah, a lot of people are sleeping on UNLV, but the Mountain West got 6 bids into the NCAA tournament. UNLV could have been a 7th, depending on how its conference tournament went in Vegas as well. And I admit I just glanced at the stats a couple minutes before we started recording, so I know probably about as much as of the Rebels as you guys do. But you mentioned the Boone twins, Caleb and you looked at the other one's name, Kalen and Caleb, the Boone twins. They're going to be loads down low. They average a combined 24 points and 12 rebounds. So if I'm Seton Hall, I look to get Bediako established early, feed it inside, get him and Davis involved, and make the bigs try to beat you. The freshman point guard Thomas, who's the leading scorer and averages about 5.5 assists a game, is going to be somebody that I would expect Dylan Adewusu to draw as a defensive assignment, just in terms of what he can do offensively. And you need a guy that can shut him down early on and make it harder for UNLV to do what it wants to do. And looking at the stats, it feels like they play somewhat similar to Seton Hall, a high 60s, low 70s team. They shoot 34% from three, so that's going to be an emphasis, just like the North Texas game was. I think as long as Seton Hall does what it does and dictates tempo, dictates the terms of the game, I think the Pirates are in the driver's seat.
They also are very well coached by, Kevin Kruger, son of Lon Kruger. He's someone who will probably hit. If he keeps his run going at UNLV, he's certainly someone who's going to get mentioned for bigger job. Although the Mountain West jobs are not smaller jobs, he's definitely someone who's going to be on the radars for some major jobs in the next couple of years. He might need to get UNLV to an NCAA tournament at some point, but certainly the pedigree. Two great, younger generation coaches going at it on Wednesday night between Kruger of UNLV and Holloway for Seton Hall.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kevin Kruger will eventually be a candidate for a Power 5 job, and not just off of his dad's name, but I think just off of what he's done himself at UNLV. And you look at what he replaced. When TJ Otzelberger was there before he took the Iowa State job, he was under 500 in 2 years before he went to Iowa State and turned the Cyclones back into a top 10 program. So UNLV had fallen on hard times, but it's a very deceptively strong job. I think with the right coach and the right pieces, you can do damage there. If UNLV can build off this season and have a run like it had in the past, I could see Kruger coaching at a higher level. And his father's been all over the country, at Florida, at Illinois, at Oklahoma. So there's no telling where he'd be able to go.
So now I want to bring in, a couple important little things of context. You talk about UNLV being an under the radar job in terms of the name brand of UNLV. We all know in the 80s and the early 90s, UNLV was a big brand, especially with D'Artagnan, winning championship with Larry Johnson, Greg Anthony, Anderson Hunt, Stacey Augmon, what have you. And so to bring in historical context, 35 years ago, I believe today, 35 years ago today, at the time recording, March 25th, Seton Hall defeated UNLV in the West Regional Final to get to the 89 Final Four in Seattle.
Wow.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jaden.
No, that I completely forgot UNLV was in the tournament path for Seton Hall that year.
Yeah, Elite Eight.
I think
Seton Hall
Jason mentioned that in a tweet the other way. I think Jason Garrett, who writes for Daly Dose of Hoops, does a tremendous job. He tweeted that out. I think it was Sunday night. Now, not that I didn't forget that myself, because even though it was right before I went to Seton Hall, I was a fan right before I got there. And then you put in the context that a lot of those players who played on that 89 UNLV team became the foundation for the team that just ran roughshod over the 1999 NCAA tournament, particularly that final game against Duke out in Denver for the national championship in 1990. So interesting little historical matchup on Wednesday night, even though the setting is not McNichols Arena and 16,000 people in a pro stadium. It's 1,300 people in a small college bandbox on Wednesday night.
And the funny thing is also 1991, UNLV was still undefeated, and Seton Hall lost to them in the West Regional Final in Seattle before Duke ended their undefeated season in the national semi. So there's a lot going on. And by the way, I want to point out with this UNLV team, they boat raced Creighton back in December. So, I mean, should Seton Hall fans take that with a grain of salt, or what's your take?
Yeah, December, I think a non-conference game doesn't have as much bearing on a late March postseason quarterfinal, but I do think it's something that Seton Hall fans should keep in the back of their minds as a team that does have the potential to not only step up in class, but take down the opponent at the higher level. And it just reaffirms the type of commitment that the Pirates are going to need on both ends of the floor to take down this UNLV team that is capable of pulling off the upset, as you mentioned, in the 15-point win against Creighton. That was at home too, I believe. But looking at the rest of the schedule, they were close against Florida State, lost to San Diego State in the Mountain West opener, and avenged that loss. San Diego State will be playing the following night in the Sweet 16 on Thursday against UConn. So it's going to be a tough matchup. I don't know if that Creighton game holds as much weight as it may have 3 months ago, but if you're a Seton Hall fan, you're definitely concerned.
Now,
and they also beat in the standings 3 teams in the Mountain West that made the NCAA tournament. San Diego State, they finished a game ahead of them, and they finished 2 games better than New Mexico and Colorado State that ended up in the brackets. So there's a lot of similarities in terms of their records in conference and in terms of their overall records between Seton Hall and UNLV. I mean, it's no surprise that they're playing in an important game in the last week of March. So, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Again, the crowd could be a big factor. One thing I'm thinking, and I don't know if you would feel the same way about this, Jaden or Tim, is the people. Even though there's only 1,300 people, they're amongst 1,300 the most dedicated Seton Hall fans. I mean, first come goes to the longer time season ticket holders, the people who go to every game at the Rock, whether they're playing Villanova or whether they're playing Wagner. They're going to be there every night, and that's reflected on what's happened over the past week. And then the second group are the students. Many of the Bluebeard Army guys, a couple of them who have appeared on Hoisted Colors, who lead the charge vocally. They bring the energy that they bring in the first couple of rows of the student section of the Rock, and they bring it in the Walsh Gym for these types of games. So I think if there's probably an X factor on Wednesday night's game between 2 evenly matched teams, it might be the noise and the dedication of those mighty, loyal Seton Hall fans who are going to find their way in the Walsh Gymnasium on Wednesday night.
I agree with you on that, Pat. I think it's tougher for UNLV because you're going from getting 7,000-8,000 at the Thomas and Mack Center, almost like Seton Hall gets the Rock, to an on-campus bandbox with 13, 14, 1,500 people. It's going to make them feel out of place, out of sorts. And I think for UNLV, the biggest key to victory is going to be overcoming that atmosphere and taking the juice out of the crowd early. If they don't get off to a hot start, it's going to be a long night.
Although they did win at Jadwin last week. So, I mean, I don't know, Jadwin, my sense of it, you've only been there once, I've only been there once. My sense is that the energy at an Ivy League game is not quite the same as what you see in Walsh Gymnasium.
It's not, and Jadwin is still quadruple the capacity of Walsh, so it's going to be an entirely different animal.
So, and it's funny how Pat brought up Jadwin Gymnasium because UNLV defeated Princeton in the opening round of the NIT last week, and now I think the fact that they were just in New Jersey last week, and then they flew back to Vegas to play Boston College at home, and now they got to come all the way back to New Jersey. I think that's gonna mean they took care of business, and not they took care of business because I thought Princeton was a better team overall, but they still went into on the road and beat Princeton, and now they got to come all the way back. I feel like all the travel, I think that's going to catch up to them Wednesday night.
Absolutely, Tim. Good point there. Going back and forth across the country does mess with you after a while, and with a short turnaround too, coming from New Jersey to Vegas back to New Jersey, that's definitely going to mess with UNLV a little bit. And I think also it'll probably be important to slow the game down a little bit, maybe keep Seton Hall in the half court to preserve your own legs. So we'll see how that turns out too.
Overall game prediction for this game. I mean, I'll defer to both of you in terms of what you think the ultimate outcome of the game will be. Pat, I'll start with you and then save Jaden best for last.
Yeah, I think if Seton Hall can do what they need to do on boards, I think if Seton Hall does what they need to do to close out the three, which are things which at times this season have been easier said than done. But I think if they can do those two things well, because those are the two strengths of UNLV, they can find their way. They can find their way to victory. I think they also have to have the proper mindset coming into this game. I think that now you're at this is the biggest game of the NIT. This is the biggest game of the NIT if you want to think about it, because this is the difference between you made it to the quarterfinals or you get to the Final Four. I mean, granted, it's not the Final Four, the one they're playing out in Phoenix in a week and a half, but it's still, in terms of where you're at, you've got to take the attitude that this is the biggest game, because there's definitely people give you more credit if you make the NIT semifinals than if you bow out in the quarterfinals. And of course, this is a big one for Dre Davis, because a win here brings him back to Indianapolis. So maybe he's the one who steps up on Wednesday night and says, this UNLV team's not keeping me back from playing a couple more games in front of my home crowd in Indianapolis next week. So I think Seton Hall's got enough incentive to find a way to knock off what's going to be a tough UNLV team.
Yeah, I think so too. And I also think beating North Texas the way that Seton Hall did saved something in the tank for this one. I think Seton Hall maybe not jumps on UNLV, but establishes the pace of the game the way it wants it on Wednesday and has a comfortable first half lead. Maybe UNLV comes close early in the second, but I think the experience and the will to win is going to be what decides this game. I think Seton Hall wins probably by about 9 or 10 points at the end, gets an NIT semifinal. I hate that it's not at the Garden because I won't be able to cover it, but I do think Seton Hall is still going to have something more to play for at the end of the week.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all, biased or not, I just think Seton Hall is the better team. And that's no knock on UNLV because, they started off slow this year and finished fourth in the Mountain West, which, unfortunately, with how the NCAA tournament has panned out, it doesn't really carry as much weight. But considering the Mountain West did have 6 teams, and I don't want to say how many they should have had, but still, they had 6 bids. UNLV finished ahead of 3 of the teams that made it in. So credit where credit's due. But I just think Seton Hall is in a better position. They're more motivated. That external factor with jet lag and the adjustment, they coming from the East Coast and then going back to the Pacific time zone, beating Boston College. I mean, they can get away with it a couple times, but not this time around. Seton Hall's not going to be denied. I think they're going to take a page out of the Xavier 2022 playbook when they won the NIT. Granted, different circumstances because they fired Travis Steele. I think after the first round game in that tournament, which was also a nail biter, and then they won comfortably against Florida. And then they won a nail biter against Vanderbilt, I want to say. Like, I can see them taking a very similar path. I wouldn't be shocked if this ends up being a nail biter, but Seton Hall is going to win this game, and they're going to punch their ticket to the NIT Final Four. I just believe in these guys. They have the motivation. And even though it's the NIT, it's amazing to see how much this fan base has bought into them. Like at this point, like win the whole thing, screw it. Like it's an NIT banner, but it's still a banner that you can have on your mantle. And look at what it did. Look at what winning the NIT did for Xavier a couple years ago. Granted, again, they brought in Sean Miller, but the year after that, which was last year, they were in the Sweet 16. So I really like the direction and that trend for Seton Hall to get to that NIT Final Four at Hinkle Fieldhouse, a place where they have had a lot of success in recent years. I think they've only lost twice there since 2017. So that in and of itself is remarkable. So again, long-winded answer, but to keep it short, give me the Pirates beating the running Rebels nearly to the date of when they beat them out in Denver to punch their ticket to the Final Four way back in 1989, which fans look on so fondly. And hopefully we get back to those days sooner rather than later. So again, that's 7 o'clock Wednesday night, ESPN2, NIT quarterfinals, Seton Hall, UNLV. Jaden, we appreciate your time again. For those of you watching, make sure to check out his blog, Daly Dose of Hoops. It's an exceptional blog covering the entirety of the tri-state area, New Jersey, New York, and the Metro Atlantic Athletic Conference as well. One of the slept-on mid-major conferences in all of college basketball. We appreciate your coverage, Jaden, of not the entire area, but especially our Seton Hall Pirates. So appreciate the time and appreciate the insight you could provide for us on this episode this week.
Absolutely, gentlemen. Thank you so much for having me on. It's always my pleasure to cover Seton Hall. One of the more endearing beats for me in the area.
So that's going to do it for this week's edition of Hoist the Colors. For Pat Madden and our guest, Jaden Daly, I'm Tim Best. Thanks for tuning in, and hopefully the next time that we come on the air, your Pirates will be in the NIT Final Four and on their way to Hinkle Fieldhouse to maybe recreate some magic of their own, like in the movie Hoosiers, but that remains to be seen. So, until next time, onward to Tonia.